Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 13, Abrignali. Abrignali. Serpendis stirred, then slowly opened his eyes. Soft grey light filled his vision as his surroundings slowly came into focus. He had a strange metallic taste in his mouth, and his tongue felt swollen. His muscles ached, and he felt cold and dry, as if emerging from a deep fever. He was lying in a white gossamer sling suspended above the ground, his legs together and his arms crossed over his chest, as the sides of the sling were pulled up high on either side of him. He still had his robe on, but his knife and belt were missing, as was the phoenix feather. Feeling around slightly with his hand, he discovered he still had the pouch of Cynthian coins inside one of his hidden pockets. He shifted slightly and felt immense pain shooting up his left leg. Looking down, he saw his bare foot, swollen and bruised, was bent oddly at the ankle. His right arm was numb from his shoulder to his hand, and much of his right side ached with each breath. "Well, I'm not going anywhere any time soon," he thought to himself. Any movement or adjustment of any kind contributed to the gentle swaying of the sling that contained him. Above him stretched more of the thin, pale, translucent material pulled taut in various directions around the many trunks and branches around him. Light filtered through the material, revealing fine veins and shimmering, oily opalescence that reminded Serpendis of silk from a butterfly chrysalis or wings of an insect. A gentle breeze caused everything to sway slightly, and for a brief moment he felt nauseous. He gently lowered the left side of his sling with his left hand, where he found dozens of little creatures staring at him with large, reflective eyes. Smaller than a human child in their 10th year, they immediately struck him as having characteristics similar to tree frogs, with smooth skin in patterns of green, brown, yellow, and black, and blue in some rare cases. Their bulbous eyes were black and blinked one eye at a time. To his amazement, they stood upright on two legs, and each wore a variety of different styles of breeches and tunics that conveyed an organized societal structure. Some among the crowd conveyed a militaristic quality with pieces of leathery armor and little caps and helmets. Others portrayed a noble aesthetic, with robes and gowns of light-woven material. One was ornamented more simplistically, but wielding parchments and a long feathered inking quill. The one in front was mostly unclothed, except for several layers of translucent gossamer fabric, much like the sling Serpendis lay in. Looking down, he saw that the floor was composed of soft green and brown moss, thick like bedding. Black circles were burnished into the moss. One large circle surrounded his sling, and the creature with the quill stood within a smaller circle. They were all barefoot and barehanded, with 3 long toes and fingers and opposing thumbs. Each digit expanded into a swollen tip that featured the brightest of colors available from each individual's palette. Their splayed toes gripped nervously at the underlying moss while staring at Serpendis. A collective ambient drone of several levels and octaves, comprising various chirps, gurgles, growls, and gritty hums, sang from the crowd before him. It wasn't a loud nor unpleasant sound, but it hung in the air like a soothing, watchful presence that responded to every movement Serpendis made. Slowly he sat up, feeling the sling shift unsteadily beneath him. He winced as more pain shot through his leg from his broken ankle and his dislocated shoulder. The material of the sling was thin, elastic, and extremely strong to carry his weight, he surmised. He carefully swung his legs around and planted his feet onto the soft, cool moss bedding in the room. Putting any weight on his hurt foot caused excruciating pain that he was barely able to stifle. Immediately the crowd tensed and shuffled backwards. The drone they were all singing together stopped, save for the one standing resolutely within its own burnished circle. It looked up at Serpendis with its large, unreadable eyes as it continued its own song. The chamber was walled on all sides by the translucent gossamer sheets. Serpendis took several long, painful breaths, holding his unhurt hand to his chest, and said quietly in low Canonian, "Friend." Then he slowly gestured to his audience and said, "Friends?" The one standing in its own circle stopped singing, and after a few moments of awkward silence, it knelt and drew 3 small circles into the moss, arranged in triangular fashion. Serpendis noticed that it burned the tracing into the soft moss with a slightly glowing bulbous finger, trailing wisps of smoke behind it. It then pointed to one, made a chirp, and looked up at Serpendis as if waiting for a reply. Then it looked back down, pointed to another one, and then the third, each time looking at Serpendis for an answer. "Is it asking me to name the moons?" he wondered. Slowly and painfully, he lowered himself from the sling, sat on the bedded floor with his hurt leg outstretched to the side, and gestured toward the 3 circles. "Albamiluna, Rubramiluna, Viridraluna," he said, pointing to different points in the sky with his healthy arm. The creature then pointed to the circles again, each time pointing to Serpendis, and each time with a little chirp from deep within its throat while cocking its head. A long time passed during this stalemate, with the 2 of them going back and forth, trying to learn from each other. The day wore on, and the light shifted to what Serpendis believed might be sometime in the afternoon, until he realized that he was extremely parched and becoming very hungry. Fatigue started to overtake him from his painful injuries. Other creatures filtered in and out of the room, and the one addressing Serpendis also looked to be getting tired and hungry as it sat cross-legged in front of Serpendis. Standing, it addressed several others who quickly left the proceedings. After a while, the crowd parted as a surprising array of food and drink arrived. Serpendis noticed several different beverages among the wooden bowls, including syrup water and a sweet, earthy wine. Little wooden cups were provided for scooping the drinks from the bowls. The food consisted of insects and grubs of various shapes and sizes, as well as leaves, vegetables, tubers, and mushrooms. Serpendis gingerly picked at the strange food, longing for a hot tavern meal that he could actually recognize. He watched his companion delicately sample from each of the offerings, occasionally looking back at him while making occasional guttural sounds from its throat, as if making light table conversation that Serpendis could not remotely understand. After a while, a smaller creature shuffled its way through the crowd and moved past the interrogator. To Serpendis's surprise, it went behind Serpendis and quickly clambered up his back, pulling at his robe, and settled around Serpendis's head. It hung its legs down on either side of Serpendis's face, wrapped its arms around his neck, rested its head on top of Serpendis's head. Serpendis felt smooth, cool, waxy, little hands and bulbous fingers kneading meticulously around his throat. He felt a slight purring from its head and throat. Despite this sudden and strange behavior, Serpendis didn't feel any danger from the creature now embracing his head. Serpendis studied the interrogator while all this happened for any context, but it merely stared unmoving while the smaller one got settled around Serpendis's head. Then the interrogator went back to eating more food, offering no clue as to what just happened. Finally, the interrogator stood up after a final drink from his cup, lifted its hand towards Serpendis, and hummed a low drone from deep within its throat. He felt the smaller frog-like creature around his head slump a little, pressing its head more firmly on top of Serpendis's head. The interrogator moved some of the plates and bowls around the 3 burnished circles, pointed a finger until it glowed hot, and burned a larger circle into the moss around the 3 small circles. Then it slowly drew another circle around the first one, then another around the first two. After about a dozen concentric circles radiating outward from the inner three circles, it stopped and looked up and pointed to Serpendis. It vocalized several guttural chirps and groans, and Serpendis suddenly felt slight subdermal vibrations from the frog creature around his head. Resonating through his skull and deep within his auditory senses, his mind began to configure the vibrations into rough, broken syllables. Then, to Serpendis's amazement, the syllables slowly blended together phonetically and grammatically, merging into coarse yet coherent words in Low Canonian. "Which of these be you?" inquired the guttural, growling, groaning words in his mind. Immediately after the shock of understanding these creatures for the very first time, he realized that the interrogator was talking about the Druids. The three circles in the middle were the three hierophants that Karui and Piecora spoke of, and the surrounding circles were the concentric layers of the Druidic community. "I am no Druid," Serpendis answered slowly, and as he did so, he felt the little frog fingers placed around his throat squeeze slightly, as if trying to feel every aspect of his larynx. The fingertips were large, round, and warm, with smooth, dry, cool skin, and they sucked onto his throat when pressed. Serpendis felt the fingers vibrate as he spoke, and out from the mouth of the creature resting on his head, he heard drones and croaks and chirps, translating his words back into their language. Serpendis learned that the interrogator was named Mozelthvar, as translated to Canonian letters and sounds, which loosely meant scribe, note-taker, or speaker. Mozelthvar was a respected matron among her people, and her voice carried far. The smaller translator, the one around his head, was named Kiahalla, and he was one of Mozelthvar's many offspring. Thus, Serpendis was finally able to understand and communicate with the Abrignalians, the little tree gnomes of Abrignali who lived deep within Kiahalla, that no man had ever encountered before. He spent many days with the Abrignalians as they tended to his injuries, feeding and nourishing him. He learned much about their ways, that they have no central government or leaders, but rather they were self-ruled by a complex and rigid system of policies that were mutually agreed upon and revisited each year. These rules were rarely broken, as their very survival depends on them. He learned that they were masters of illusion and trickery, and that they remained hidden from interlopers in the upper reaches of Kiahalla. A shroud of invisibility surrounded their entire city in the trees, maintained by those dedicated to singing within the special frequency that bent the light around them and nullified their sounds. They treated him to witness how they crafted their gossamer tapestry that served so many functions within their society, a variety of combinations of tree sap, ground vegetation, and their own saliva. He returned the gesture by teaching them a few things. He described his homeland of Canania, the 7 cities and coast haven. Using pieces of their gossamer sheets, he showed them paper crafts that he would use to entertain children with back home. He sang for them a few tavern songs as well as a hymn from the Dolgithadden Temple Library. He introduced to them his desire to cook his meals. After realizing that open flame of any kind was greatly feared for how quickly it could damage their society, he resorted to holding insects over the heated fingers of those Abrignali with such powers. Most fascinating of all, he began to learn how to speak as they did. By positioning his fingers and massaging his throat with his hands while he spoke, much like his translator Kiahalla did in the beginning, he changed the sound of his voice into a gritty, groaning murmur that approximated their deep, guttural sounds while clicking and chirping the words of their language. Simultaneously, he began to understand their language without the need for translation by Kiahalla. Eventually, he found that he could speak their language with primitive effectiveness and began to understand them without any assistance at all. In the beginning, he suffered constant bouts of nausea from being so high up in the swaying trees, combined with both the strange food and the pain from his injuries. But over time, he acclimated, and the motion sickness gradually went away. At the same time each day, someone checked progress on his foot and shoulder, mending his wounds and nursing him back to health as best as they could without fully understanding his biology. Thus, the bones in his ankle never fully healed correctly, and for the rest of his days he would walk with a limp, his foot always turned inward. Eventually, his arm did heal, but only after he instructed a few of the Abrignalians to help him reset his right shoulder, and he rested his arm in a sling made from the soft but strong gossamer material that he later learned they called gui, in a way similar to how Canonians use the term parchment. One day, Serpendis sat on a wide moss-covered branch, which he estimated was about as wide as the Road of Charlatans in Coast Haven, and it made him miss his home. He remembered how the road could fit 4 wagons side by side, going in opposing directions with room for streetwalkers, artisans, criers, and performers. It seemed like another life. As he basked in the warm sun, sipping a cup of nectar, he thought of his companions down below and wondered whether they survived the attack several nights ago. Or was it weeks or months ago? With his right arm resting in its sling and his bad foot stretched before him, he tried to relax and soak in these calming moments while fending off his deep yearning for home. Looking to the side, he saw Mozelthwag approaching him with an entourage from a neighboring branch. One Abrignalian held his tooth knife, another his belt. Mozelthwag herself carried the phoenix feather reverently, as if it held some sort of hidden power. He could see the feather's heat mirage peeling off its edges and distorting her figure as she walked. As she came near, he slowly closed both eyes simultaneously and bowed his head in warm greeting. She and the group following her did the same. "How comes the day to you, and its warmth?" she asked, through a soft drone suffused with clicks and chirps that sounded like gravel through a strainer. He looked at her for several moments before answering, as his mind roughly pieced together the salutation. Soothing, invigorating, satiating. Matron Mozelthwag, he replied, working his throat with his fingers and forming the sounds and syllables as closely to their speech as humanly possible. "We are in gladness for the air to be still on this day," she said. "A quiet day, a day of pondering, which is why I seek you now. May we discuss with you?" She held the feather before her, presenting it with both hands like someone would handle a blade. "Of course, matron," Serpendis said. Despite spending what felt like more than a week with these people, he still had a very hard time reading their faces and body language. He gave up on guessing or going with his gut regarding their reactions, as more often than not, his hunch would be wrong. One subtle shift or movement might seem like something positive to him based on his familiarity with humans, but then he would later realize the gesture was the response from being insulted, general awkwardness, or disagreement. On the other hand, he could all too easily mistranslate a shake of the head or a slight snort as dismissive or a negative response, just to learn that in fact the Abrignalian was happy, or one of many of their expressions of laughter. So he tried to remain as neutral as possible with his interactions with the Abrignalians. "Know you of the Shengthiang?" asked Mozelthwag. The name sounded familiar to Serpendis, and after several moments it came to him. "Scythians?" he asked, using his known word for the Eldar, but still speaking in the Abrignalian throat voice. He reached into his hidden pocket and withdrew the pouch of Scythian platinum coins. He picked one out and held it in front of her. They all reacted excitedly, shifting their feet and even hopping slightly, turning and tilting their heads this way and that. Mozilthwa gripped the feather tightly and said, "You are friend, then, of Shengtiang?" "I am," Serpentis answered, bowing and hoping this mild deceit wouldn't get him in trouble. Of course he couldn't say no to this question, as it was the Eldar who would help him, and his friends, when he finds them again, get back home. But now he was nervous about where this conversation might be going with the Abrignalian matron. She then stood very still, her head held up high and to the side, looking at him sideways, another Abrignalian gesture that he could never seem to read correctly. "You say you are no Druvwai," she said, "yet you carry these things, and you are friend of Shengtiang." She held the feather out in front of her. "Wezilia Enkrikenge, flame feather, tribute, for Bogian Cremaran," she continued. Then she waved her hand to her entourage, and both the knife and the belt were laid before Serpentis. She pointed at the objects, saying, "Elpianthos eskri kliaung driaganth, dronge, knife, weapon, tooth, sacred, tooth of Bogian Cremaran." She gestured quickly with her head at the Scythian coin that Serpentis held. "Gwerka, Shengthiang Gwerka, you say you are no Druvwach, yet you carry these things, and you are friend of Shengthiang." Around the matron, the Abrignalians quietly chanted, "Bogean Crimaran." Curiously, Serpentis felt the structure of the word was not Abrignalian, but instead seemed to have a more elven characteristic. "Why say you that you are no druid when you carry these things? And your ears, they are rounded?" asked Mozilthwa after several moments. "Rounded ears. Have they met humans before? Or is this another indication for them that makes me a druid?" He wondered to himself. Why would they make that assertion, other than that they met druids before, or a druid, and they had ears like mine? If so, who? Serpentis's mind raced as he placed his left hand on his throat to speak with his voice distorted into the gritty, monotonal drone of the Abrignalian throat voice. "I am no druid. I have no powers. You have nothing to fear from me," he said as calmly as he could, trying to convey a relaxed tone within the guttural throat voice. Then he took a measured risk by saying, "But I am friends with Scythians. I am returning these items to them. I am lost in this forest and must get to Cynthia. I assure you that I am no druid. If I were a druid, I would not be lost, and you would not have captured me. Things would be different." He heard the veiled threat in his droning throat voice despite himself as the words fell out of his mouth, and he wondered for the first time if he was veering into real danger from the Abrignalians. As best as Serpentis could guess, based on their reactions, this response seemed to only cause more confusion among them. Mozilthwa looked visibly frustrated. During his entire stay with the Abrignalians up to this point, he was treated with kindness and graciousness, so long as, in his mind, he remained as innocuous and unthreatening as possible, and he calculated that this meant always denying any connection with druids. Occasionally the topic of druids would come up, always with some level of consternation. He couldn't help but wonder if they were harmed by druids in the past. He was also unsure about their relationship with Cynthia, as at no point did they ever mention them, nor convey any association of any kind with the Eldar. Until now. He felt like with each response, he stepped in completely uncharted territory with the Abrignalians. He frantically tried to think of what to say next, while the small crowd chattered among themselves, hopping excitedly. He worried his luck was running out, and soon they would toss him to the ground far below, to his death. Suddenly, incredulously, a loud, familiar screech rang out overhead, and a small raptor landed on the large branch behind the group of Abrignalians. Serpentis recognized the falcon immediately as Hero, but the Abrignalians jolted into defensive action. Several of the armed Abrignalians leapt at the bird of prey with spears and knives out, and Hero took off just before they landed in his place. The branches around Serpendis were swarmed with Abrignalians, all armed with weapons of many different kinds. Darts flew in the air from hollow branches and sling devices, tracking Hero's acrobatic flight movements above them. To Serpendis, Hero was a diminutive raptor, a deadly falcon, but smaller than a hawk or any other bird of prey. But to the Abrignalians, Hero's sudden appearance was like a dragon attacking their city. It all happened so quickly that Serpendis just sat there motionless while everything played out in front of him, his left hand still on his throat. Then, somewhere deep in his mind, but with the clarity of someone right behind him, he heard Piecora's voice. "There you are! We found you! Ah, spirits! Get them off me! Make them stop attacking!" Piecora's voice scared him out of his skin so much that he quickly became airborne from his seated position and shouted, "Gods of absolute hells!" without even knowing it. The Abrignalians around him, except for Moselthwag, cowered and hopped quickly away like chaff in a sudden wind gust onto other branches and trees. The frenzied surface-to-air battle of darts and slings and spears still raged on as Hero flew with dazzling speed and agility above, below, and between the branches all around them. "Don't shout! Speak with your mind! I can hear you plain enough!" Piecora shouted back into Serpendis's thoughts. "What in the gods forsaken—" his mind began, but then she interrupted him. "Make them stop attacking me, you old fealty!" cried Piecora. Without thinking, Serpendis steadied himself against the trunk behind him, keeping his weight off his broken foot. He held his left arm out straight and in his mind shouted, "Come to me!" Within moments he heard frantically flapping wings behind and beneath him, rising up to over his head. Darts zipped past Serpendis and sunk into the tree trunk behind him in a silhouetted caricature of his standing pose. Moselthwag hopped up and down, waving the flame feather above her head while singing in a surprisingly loud and powerful voice to not hit her or their guest with their weapons. Downy feathers rained down over Serpendis as Hero came down slowly, flapping madly, and landed softly on his extended forearm. Serpendis felt the tips of his deadly talons grip around his arm without penetrating his skin, and he was surprised at how light the falcon was. Hero turned to the Abrignalians near and far and let out a booming, extended screech that left Serpendis momentarily deaf in both ears. The Abrignalians cowered in unison as the sound wave hit them, knocking some of them from their branches. A long pause of anxious silence followed as Hero perched resolutely on Serpendis's arm. The Abrignalians slowly raised their eyes and looked up at the elderly human towering over them. Finally, Moselthwag nervously rose to her feet. She stood closest to Serpendis with only the knife and belt lying on the branch between her and Serpendis. She slowly raised the flame feather up to Serpendis and said quietly, "Gliruag, Druvoi, friend of Shengtiang, Bogi and Kremarani, bless you. Bless us all." "There is no convincing them otherwise now, thanks to you, Hero. Maybe this is for the good." "What do you mean? Convincing them of what?" Piecora asked, apparently now finally privy to his actual thoughts and thus able to interrupt him even within the sanctuary of his own brilliant mind. Serpendis let out an uncontrollable laugh, and Hero hopped off his arm and flew up to a branch over his head. He laughed long and hard as each thing that he connected from recent and current events only added to the comedy that he found himself in. This was, of course, blended with his blissful relief at learning that his coarse, rude, and most beautifully wonderful friend Piecora was still alive. Her voice could not possibly be a concoction of his own madness, for in no way would he think to willfully interrupt himself in the way she constantly did. His ongoing and uplifting laughter hurt his chest and shoulder even as it healed his mind, which seemed always on the brink of despair lately. He slowly slid down the trunk he was leaning on, still laughing as he took the flame feather from Mozeltwach, who stared at both him and Hero, jerking her eyes and head as she changed perspectives between the two. The heat from the feather was soothing in his hand, and he pressed it against his shoulder and chest. Still outwardly giggling, he said in his mind, "They are certain I am a druid now. Hero just convinced them of that, and eventually I'll be exposed. 'Tis only a matter of time. But perhaps I was wrong about all of this, and they do not fear druids. Now what do I do?" "Where in Stag's name are you?" she said. "I don't know," he answered. "High above the ground, with these strange little people. They remind me of tree frogs that we used to catch in Dari Londoth when we were children. They are hidden from all observation by their powers of illusion, maintained by their singing. You only hear it when you're inside it. I was captured by them during the night of the attack, and I woke up as their guest. How are the others?" "We are alive and together, and we've been looking for you for over a week now," she said. "I tracked your movements from the camp until they disappeared, and we've been circling around ever since, trying to find you. We were about to give up today, in fact, but I wanted to send Hero higher up into the canopy one last time. That's when we discovered your little people." "You've been beneath us this whole time? All these days since the attack?" Serpendis asked, marveling at the illusory powers of the Abrignali. "Likely," Piecora responded. "I'm looking up now, and I can't see anything but sun and trees, and all I hear is the wind. Hero is gone from my view, from my own eyes at least. But I see you through his eyes, and this is how we are speaking now." "I didn't know you could communicate like this through Hero," Serpendis said, rubbing his eyes with his hand, and still amazed at everything transpiring around him. "Neither did I until it happened," she said. "Fascinating development," he replied, finally gathering his thoughts and thinking coherently again. "Now, we need to think about... Karui says that you have found Abrignali, the tree gnomes of Kiahalla, or rather, they found you," Piecora said. "They are known to the Banwa, but not one among them has ever met one, since it is forbidden for the Banwa to enter the forest, and the Abrignalians live very deep in the forest and never leave." Karui can barely contain her excitement. She very much wishes to meet them. "Hold that thought for a moment," Serpendis said. "I need to speak with them now." "You can speak with them?" asked Piecora incredulously. "Tell me everything that Karui knows about them," Serpendis said. "Not much else to say," Piecora said. "They are very hidden from the world, very reclusive. Wait a minute, did you say they think you are druid? Have they met humans before?" "I don't know," Serpendis said. "Haven't asked yet, but I've wondered the same thing. Their very first question to me was whether I was a druid, one of the 3 hierophants, actually, of the innermost ring of druidic society." Serpendis held his left hand to his throat while holding the flame feather in his right. He looked at Mozeltwag and droned quietly in Abrignalian, using the throat voice. "Alas, matron, I am friend of druids, and I am friend of Shengthiang. I am also your friend. I am friend of all." Hero flew down and landed on his unwounded shoulder. Mozeltwag bent down to her knees and bowed, droning, "Then you are friend of Abrignalith, as we are friend of Druvwai, friend of Shengthiang. Bogian Cremaran bless you, bless us all." Serpendis sent a thought to Piecora via Hero. "Know anything about the name Bogian Cremaran? It is reverent to them. I believe it is their god, or a god. I've heard them chanting it." After several moments, Piecora answered in his mind, "No, I've never heard of it, and neither has Karui." Behind Mozeltwag, the rest of the Abrignalians bowed in similar fashion, and all remained still for several long moments of hushed solemnness. Only the ambient droning surrounding the city could be heard as it maintained the illusory shield, hiding them from below. Finally, Serpendis stood up, gathering the belt and the knife, and said, "We have friends far below us. On the floor, I must go to them. Will you come with me?" Mozzeltvag looked up and stood motionless for a few moments before saying, "We have been watching them. We think they are hunting you. They are friend?" "Yes," Serpendis answered. "We need to get to Cynthia Shengthiang, as you say, safely and quietly." Mozzeltvag stood up and chirped loudly, and gradually the surrounding Abrignalians began moving on their own, in different direction. Serpendis estimated there were several hundreds of them on small and large branches all around them, as well as clinging to the many trunks that spiraled upward into the canopy overhead. "We will come with you, Druvai friend," she said. Later that afternoon, following much discussion and strategizing, Serpendis was lowered down by a sling of woven guyee, while several Abrignalians scaled the trees downward around him. The descent took longer than Serpendis expected, indicating just how far above the ground the Abrignalians lived. Hyro flew in circles around the area, darting between branches and limbs. After a long, arduous while, and as the sun had just begun to set below the canopy, Serpendis gently touched earth. His arm was still in its sling, and he had a long stick that was fashioned for him to use as a crutch. Karui and Piecora ran over to him and embraced him warmly while lifting him out of the sling. Serpendis wondered if he might have such a greeting back home, for despite having a large extended family and several children, and a network of friends and colleagues among the tapestry, his life in Coast Haven was fairly solitary. He lived most days consumed with work, and his social interactions were mostly superficial. There were only a few people he actually liked in the world. Nothing from his previous life could compare to the genuine warmth he felt from, and for, his new friends here in Kiahalla. When he was set upright, Vynexi embraced them all with his long, thin arms. "It is so good to be together again," Vynexi said. "I thought we lost you, old man." Serpendis grabbed Vynexi's curled horn and shook it jovially, tussling Vynexi's hair. He noticed that the boy was shirtless, and only his loose linen trousers clothed him. From Vynexi's sternum all the way to his belly button was a massive scar that made Serpendis's spine tingle right up to his neck. "Dear gods, boy," Serpendis blurted, "they really got you. How did you survive?" Vynexi chuckled weakly, then doubled over in pain, as the scar was still fresh from healing only recently since the Hyalangorn attack. "That is for another time, actually," said Piecora, looking around them at the growing mob of Abrignalians surrounding them. "Watch this," Serpendis sneered sideways at Piecora. He then placed his left hand on his throat and worked his larynx with his fingers to produce the Abrignalian throat voice. He then addressed the crowd in Abrignalian. "Friends, druid friends, Glirua Druvai, thank you for your warm hospitality. These are my friends, our friends." Serpendis recognized Mozzeltvag as she stepped forward from the crowd, and he introduced her to his companions. Mozzeltvag bowed and slowly closed both eyes in unison, and his friends also bowed slowly in response. Serpendis then offered a Cynthian coin to Mozzeltvag, saying, "You have already done more for us than we can ever repay you for, but there is one more thing I would ask of you. Please show us the way to Shengthiang." Mozzeltvag declined the offered coin, saying, "We have no need for such object, but we will take you to Shengthiang if you use our ways." Serpendis tilted his head and said, "And what are your ways?" "Above and over. Bottom is where there is death, and night comes soon. We should all be above, where we eat, rest, then leave in morning. Go to Shengthiang, above and over. Serpentis looked at his friends nervously and relayed her information. They will take us to Cynthia, but we must all be taken to their home, where we will eat, rest, and leave in the morning. They mean to take us to Cynthia through the upper reaches of the trees. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.